This case here that I'm doing right now is the case of David Brom. It's a very important case. A child, more or less a child serial killer, age 16, when all of these horrific events occurred. We're going to be analyzing that in some good detail here. So look forward to that next, and be sure to get the word out about these videos. I appreciate it, because together we are able to solve a lot of crimes. Thank you again. Here we go. David Brom was only just age 16 when he would choose to murder his entire family with a broadside axe in central Minnesota. According to court documents, police went to the Brom residence after they were notified about a rumor floating around the school that something terrible happened in the Brom residence. Police would discover the bodies of David's father, mother, brother, and sister. David and his older brother were missing from the home. Initially, police thought that David Brom himself had been kidnapped. However, soon after, a female schoolmate would tell police that David had confessed to murdering his entire family. Apparently, David Brom was involved in an argument with his father at the time, and once his father was asleep, David Brom decided to kill him and his mother at that point in time. David Brom was heading to his sister's bedroom when he found her and his youngest brother in the hallway and murdered them both. This teenage killer, at age 16, was sentenced to 3 life sentences in prison. So this is an important case, very important. I'm hoping that you guys can really spread this far and wide and get the news out there, get more people apprised with it. It is the case of David Brom, who is currently still incarcerated in 1989. Sunday marks a dark anniversary in the city of Rochester. David Brom brutally murdered his entire family, the father, mother, brother, and sister, with a broadside axe in their home right outside Rochester 30 years ago to this date. Olmsted County Sheriff Kevin Torgerson was a deputy at the time and first to arrive at the scene. When he reflects on his 34-year career in law enforcement, there are countless cases he can recall, but undoubtedly none that compare to February 8, 1988. That was when David Brom chose to pick up this broadside axe and really showed everyone how sinister he truly is. This is important because we're going to be covering some things, as I explained earlier. They had a lot of interesting relationships as children, especially David Brom. He liked to play board games like life. He also liked to play chess, similar things. Speaks about that a little bit. And that's important. But what is most important of all in this case is to recognize David Brom was indeed a psychopath. A psychopath is someone who just does not display any kind of real remorse. Doesn't matter what their actions are. They don't show signs of remorse, of course. And he had done similar things to this before murdering his whole family. And so some of those things are going to be covered in this video. It's not going to be very long, but it is going to cover kind of the historical record of David Brom. What would drive someone, at age 16, of all things, to pick up an axe in such a way? And after everything that he gone through, and after really actually being supported by his friends and having a good life and similar, that he would pick up an axe. What would lead to something like that? And, David Brom was absolutely a true psychopath, and so it's good to explore the question in detail, and we're going to explore that in detail a bit. Even though he did play chess, he played the board game of life, he played Monopoly and similar things, none of those aspects really are what would lead someone like David Brom to make this kind of decision. His friends have been supporting him. He had people in his life that really cared. It just seems strange that he would choose to, at age 16, pick up a broadside axe and just viciously, take out his entire family, essentially. So we're going to be exploring that a bit. The psychology of David Brom is what's very, very important to recognize and get underneath quite a bit. He was a psychopath, and he was born in an interesting location of Rochester. And he unfortunately had the character traits of a psychopath in the early history. And he's still locked up, not surprisingly, in Stillwater. But there were a myriad of things that led him to essentially do this. And it's one of the most vicious crimes that's ever been witnessed in Minnesota. So we are going to explore that a bit, kind of in detail, the history of what really led up to his vicious murders. And then another case tomorrow in the morning will also be a child-focused case of a serial killer who was very young, who ended up doing a very similar thing to what David Brom did. But this case is very important. It's kind of flew under the radar. A lot of people didn't know that this took place. And the way that he did it was just what was the most unbelievable aspect. He took this axe and he just, out of nowhere, started killing his whole family, including the brother, including the sister. Folks just couldn't believe it. It was quite an interesting trial in Rochester, Minnesota's history. So we'll be going over that. We'll be going over kind of the news that covered this a bit. And I want people to keep this case fresh in their mind and not forget what took place here. Because it just seemed like this type of thing was just not normal. Like it couldn't happen. But in this particular case, it did. And it really affected the community. And Mr. Sheriff Torgerson, in other words, he went on to describe how shocked he was to see just the whole house was filled with some of these personal effects. And they found the broadside axe just kind of sticking out, so to speak. And so this is very interesting, and it truly deserves in-depth study and understanding, because it's not every day you see someone who's age 16 and does something as horrible as this. We see it every day with serial killers, with people who clearly didn't need to be released and out there on the street. That doesn't come as any surprise. But a 16-year-old, or a 14-year-old, that's something that's a lot more rare and a lot more uncommon. So we're going to cover that very, very studiously. It's a good case to study. There's a lot of good information involved. You can learn a lot, and hopefully more people become aware of this case. Like and spread the news. Thank you. So again, what we see here is a textbook case of a psychopath who over time was ignored and driven into a certain state of mind. And I'm not going to set that aside. I mean, he was born with psychopathic tendencies and with a psychopathic kind of mindset. That is true about David Brom. However, I don't think he was ever going to act on those impulses, and certainly not in the way that it happened and unfolded here. So we have to look at this kind of from a wider perspective when it comes to the David Brom situation. And I'm not going to play the podcast on this right now, but there's going to be a part 2 where I will be playing the podcast officially so you can listen to it. David Brom was 16 years old and the outcast of his Catholic-oriented family. He had depression that was getting progressively worse every day. For 6 months, he said he was going to kill his parents. Nobody in the offices took him seriously. After one seemingly small argument with his father about the music David Brom listened to, he then snapped. So, again, I'm not saying that this would necessarily be what leads to his actions. It covers it in a lot more depth in the podcast, for sure, which I'm going to officially be kind of highlighting it in part 2, also tomorrow. But certainly this is part of what took place with David Brom. He was an outcast. In other words, he had people that supported him, they liked to play games with him, but he was on the whole an outcast in his immediate community. And that's a very, very serious accusation. When you're an outcast, in the case of like the Dylan Klebold case in that city in Colorado, that leads to some very, very serious twists and turns. So, part of the reason for his actions, and I'm not making any excuse for it by any means, but part of the reason was the fact that he suffered from a mania, kind of a manic depression style mania, and he was an outcast within his immediate community. I still don't believe fully that if the signs had been caught, it would have prevented these particular murders, because David Brom, there's an interesting backstory to it. He is kind of born with very real psychopathic traits. So my understanding of it, he probably still would have committed the crime. Not against his family, but probably would have done it somewhere else. But what I can tell you is that certain things happened in his community. He felt outcast in his church community. He felt like people were looking at him a certain way, or that they looked at the music he listened to, and so on. And so these can be, in certain circumstances, aggravating factors that will lead someone to make brash decisions like that. But once again, and when I listen to the podcast, it kind of confirms this, I don't believe any of those outside factors, including the music that he listened to, the games that he played with others, and similar things, really made too much of a difference with how he ended up snapping and taking out his whole family. I really do believe he would have done something similar somewhere else, because he had kind of the psychopathic traits as a very young child. But it's very important to make note of this fact, because a lot of people are not understanding that there are these people like David Brom that are quite common in certain communities. And when someone is an outcast, and when they feel like they're excluded from all activities, or even though they have friends, they aren't able to go to the school play or something simple like that, if you're talking about more junior high or high school style antics and things, that has from time to time led them down this route. We see it in the case of Dylan Klebold. So I'm not saying that this is going to always be like the case like it was here, because David Brom had a lot of other factors working against him. He had a psychopathic kind of mindset that you can see in some of the charts when he was very, very young. So similar crimes definitely would have happened, but I don't believe that he would have done something as spur of the moment, like kill his whole family, if he hadn't been suffering from mania and similar things. So we can learn a lot from this, and I want people to take this very seriously. Bring this case up to your family members and other people you come in contact with. Get the word out there. Spread the word about David Brom, because there's a lot of similar issues that have gone on in certain states before. People need to have general awareness about this case. So thank you again. Until next time. I think it's a challenge sometimes to diagnose certain situations like this, but it's nonetheless very important for us to learn. as much as we can, take a lot away from the overall experience as well. Residents woke to the news that the day before, in the quiet, snow-covered outskirts, 4 members of a respected church-going family had been killed in the most brutal fashion with a broadside axe. The suspect who was sought was the family's 16-year-old son, David Brom. There they are, kind of at the house, too. Same time that it occurred. People were afraid and they were jumpy. Tim Haraff, a retired police captain, then a 27-year-old patrol officer, recalled there were at least 3 police calls that morning, citing David Brom at the residence. Haraff and his partner David Thompson on the morning shift since 7 responded to 1 at the main post office on Valley High Drive. It was only 8:30 in the morning. Police were on the lookout for a teenager with dyed black hair wearing neon pink tennis shoes. Haraff and Thompson entered the post office with their guns drawn. We saw him standing there right away with his back to the door, staring at vending machines. We effected the arrest right afterward. So, David Brom never really gave any true purpose or reason behind what he did, but we can deduce, based upon some of the evidence that has come out since then, that he did not have a good relationship with his extended family. There's something that happened within his family precipitated him going this direction. It wasn't just an argument over music. You know, he felt excluded from school activities a lot for some reason. He felt excluded in the community he was living in the Cascade Township, north of Rochester. And he felt excluded overall from a lot of other things. And something that happened with David and his extended family is certainly part of what precipitated him choosing to do this. Like, he had a real good relationship with his uncle and similar things, but he never talked at all seriously with anyone about, for example, taking his uncle out. He was only interested in his direct family. So something happened in his life where he felt shunned. He felt disrespected by his community for them excluding him from certain activities and events, certain cultural events, such as when the band plays and things like that. He took it a lot more seriously, is what folks need to understand. He took it a lot more seriously than you would see typical kids take it, also because of his mental state when he was very, very young. You know, it was confirmed to have some of the frontal lobe in the psychopath state. You can check that out and confirm that by looking at someone's frontal lobe and looking at the actual brain pattern at the time. So they knew he had some of those aspects, but I don't think they recognized that he would take it to this extent later on, because, you know, things like being excluded from real important after-school activities affect someone like David Brom in a very serious way. And it affects him a lot more than it would affect any of the other, you know, school children. And so looking back on that and seeing it for what it is, and the fact that he was excluded a lot from his community, cultural events, excluded from, you know, when they would do operas and when they would do plays and things like that, there is a lot there that can really be taken from this, that you can learn from. And my bet is that he still would have done some crimes, but I don't know if he would have killed his entire family. And that's quite a interesting outcome. So anyway, as it goes on, it states, still it was impossible to reconcile the image of the slightly built, polite child weighing 130 pounds with a frenzied serial killer who felled and killed all of his family with nearly 60 blows from a hefty broadside axe, including his youngest brother as he lay curled up in his bed, clinging to his security blanket. So I feel like, looking back on it, younger people who had a lot of problems, like David Brom, not exactly like him, but who have similar issues, should have been warned about more often. People should have attempted to really support and help someone like that, get them into proper services, proper counseling activities that would really kind of draw that out, and include them in cultural events. Even if he was acting odd, they should have definitely included him in the events they had at the museum and all these different things, because all those things, folks, whether we recognize it or not, they play a role in what happens when someone chooses to snap. To a certain degree, they always play a role. And so I take that in a very serious manner when looking at David Brom. But at the same time, I recognize he had the frontal lobe, and when a psychologist or a doctor diagnoses that and they see the psychopathic, part of the mind and so on when they're very young, it's not something you can do really all that much about, but it is a case that we can learn a lot from. And so I hope people continue to spread this case. And it's very similar to the case of serial killer Ed Gein, which occurred in Iowa. Even though he was an adult, and it's just a lot more easy to explain with adults, but with the child or somebody who's only 16, it needs a lot of personal attention and personal diagnosis. So I hope you get this out there to a much wider audience. Spread the word, like, comment, subscribe. I really enjoy making these videos. And take care, guys. Thank you.